I'm Trevor Mallard. In the 84-87 Parliament, I was a new backbench Labor MP from a marginal seat in Hamilton. Some colleagues talked to me about some proposed legislation and asked me to be involved in essentially doing some of the maths, adding up how it was going, and trying to get a sense of what was possible to be passed through the Parliament.
So I'm Ruth Dyson, and in 1985 I came back from a trip overseas and met up with Fran Wild, who was a friend of mine, and she was pretty overwhelmed by the pressure of the work of the Homosexual Law Reform Bill, which she'd introduced as a members' bill, and I said that I could come to Wellington for a few months. I lived in Nelson, and give her a hand with stuff as a volunteer, and 15 months later I finished that voluntary job when the bill was passed. But I became part of a large team of people who answered correspondence, who engaged with community organisations or built community organisations, who worked with Trevor to look at what MPs were getting lobbied about and what issues were of concern of them, and what information we could provide to Trevor and others who were working on the bill. So I was part of a really large and amazing team of volunteers who worked for the success of the bill.
It's hard to believe how divisive the issue was 35 years ago. I think that attitudes were very different. People who were gay were much likely to be closeted, and people had lots of friends who they did not know were gay, because being out was something which was quite unusual. And so there was tremendous debate and division, a massive petition against the bill, and rallies and meetings around the country, which, frankly, I thought some of them looked like they were Nazi rallies. They were really, really awful. And like a number of these issues, it divided families. People of some faiths were intensely involved in opposition to the bill, and it was it was a tremendous achievement, but it was a truly awful period of New Zealand political history.
I guess that Trevor's description is, it's actually quite mild compared to how I think we both felt then, but reflecting back that long ago, it's hard to believe it was as bad as it was. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in my involvement in politics is that we helped change attitudes. We didn't just change the law, we helped change attitudes, so that the just terrible stories we heard of young men being kicked out of their homes because they'd come out to their parents, or mothers who despaired that their husband wouldn't speak to their son because they'd come out. They're terrible stories. The rallies that Trevor talked about were horrific, but the worst one was the one that was on the steps of Parliament. It was really Nazi style, and it was really scary. And people who I couldn't relate to at all, they were just so bigoted and so horrible in the things they said. But actually, that was the tipping point for a lot of New Zealanders. We had straight parents ringing up saying, we don't want to be on their side. We've always been anti-homosexuality. We don't want our son to be gay, but he is. But we've watched that, and that's not us. And a lot of people said, no, I won't be part of that. So that was the start of the change, because they were so excessive. And I was really proud of New Zealanders' response to that.
And I think of it as the beginning of almost like a bit of a tidal wave as far as attitudes are concerned. I mean, at the time, there was a second part of the bill which went to human rights legislation, and it was something which was very important, some of it, but we realised quite early in the process that it was very unlikely that that part of the bill would actually get passed, and that was sad, because as the bill was introduced, there were bits in it for gay men and lesbian women. And as part 2 was lost, then it was only about decriminalisation, and as the whole story went, that Queen Victoria back in her day couldn't believe that women could have relationships with other women, and therefore it wasn't against the law. There was no legal discrimination against lesbians, and so it was as part of the process that bit was lost, and even that caused some upset and division within the campaign for change.
Yeah. Because people said, what use is it being not a criminal if you don't have human rights the same as other people do? I mean, that was the basis of the concern, and who could argue with that, really? But of course, in the end, we had to progress what we could. That's really important in legislation, but it's still really frustrating that we couldn't get all the way in one go. And we had, equally remember the debate we had about 18 or 16 years of age. Yeah. It was a similar sort of thing. A lot of people said all or nothing, and the pragmatists amongst us said, wait a minute, this is a huge step. If we can make it this far, let's do it, and the rest will come.
And that was part of an essential part of my role, was trying to make the judgment about whether it was possible to pass the bill with the age at 16, which was the same age as for heterosexual sexual relationships. And there was some really weird voting occurred during the committee stages, where people who were totally opposed to the bill and people who really felt deeply that the age should be 16 were voting together. The people who were opposed to the bill hoped by radicalising it, it would cause the balance of the parliament to go against it. So I think, and then there were groups of people who supported 18 and other groups of people who supported 20. And it was a matter of trying to make a judgment as to whether the bill will go through. As it did in the end, it went through by 5 votes. There was one, we were always told that there was going to be one sort of surprise person voting for it, and that was Ian McLean, who previously had not indicated his support for the third reading, and he came across and voted for it. But there were a couple of other votes available. There were people whose electorates and possibly their own personal views were anti, but were prepared because of relatives who were gay to actually vote for the bill if it was necessary. And during the counting of the votes, those 2 members waited at the far end of the lobby until I indicated to them that we had enough to pass the bill. So, and at that point they went and voted against it. I mean, these days, because of attitudes being so different, that wouldn't happen. And you never know what to think about, people who did that. They had a set of principles, a set of views that went one way, but they also, in both cases, had close family members who were gay, and sort of couldn't see them being hurt by the loss of the bill.
But the basic bigotry and intolerance that was shown then is not around really now. There's a bit of it, but it's more people would stand up to it now than they did then. So we've given New Zealanders courage to speak out against basic bigotry, which is a really great thing. Something to be really proud of in our country, that people won't tolerate such intolerance anymore.
I mean, something that I found really interesting was that sort of not long, 6 or 7 years after the bill was passed and the human rights part was lost, it went through Parliament with a massive majority. That tide had come along, and then we got to the point of civil unions and then marriage equality. So over time, things which were just inconceivable back in the mid-1980s are now just accepted. That's the way we do things in New Zealand, and we have shown quite a lot of world leadership in that way. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of people look positively on New Zealand.
But we had the same debate in civil unions as we did about human rights. Why should you go part of the way? Why do we have not a real marriage? You have a civil union. And it was because it would be a step in the right direction. But yeah, I know a lot of my friends were really angry that I supported it because they said it wasn't real marriage.
Yeah. I've got a really radical view on that. And my view is that everyone should have civil unions, and if people want to have a church marriage or a church wedding afterwards, then it's nothing to do with the state. Why should the state worry? Let's do civil unions, and if people want to dance around a fire on a beach, that's fine. That can be their marriage ceremony. Unfortunately, I think there was only about 5 of us in the Parliament at the time civil unions went through had that point of view. So on the basis of it being a step in the right direction, I supported it.
And it was quite hard to do that. You would have had to pretty well pull the marriage legislation
That's right.
off the order paper, which wasn't quite the intent of civil unions. Yeah. But now it's progressed hugely. And the standard of debate, the level of contribution is just so different. It's extraordinary.
I think, just occasionally in, abortion legislation, we got, some of the heavy social conservatism, but it's sort of notable by its presence, whereas it was almost overwhelming in the 1980s, and we've changed. I think we've changed as individuals. Generally our own attitudes have matured and developed, and I think we've changed as a society. We've found it safe to move along, and to be much more understanding than was the case when I was young.
Yeah, no, I agree. Which is a great thing for our Parliament. I mean, we do have, it's really important that Parliament has a difference of opinions represented, because we should be representative of our country. But we have people with extreme views, but the way they express them is much more respectful and much more factual, actually. I chaired the Abortion Select Committee, and we had some submitters who came along and lied, and some submitters who came along and said really awful things about women who had had abortions, and accused women of all sorts of things, like get up in the morning and you're sick of being pregnant, so we'll just have an abortion. It was just terrible. But there were a tiny number of people compared to the overwhelming number of people who, for faith reasons or whatever other reason, talked about their opposition to abortion, but did it in a really respectful way, and did it in a way that understood, mostly understood why women may have had abortions and didn't condemn them for it. So, even on that really heated debate, overwhelmingly much more respectful.
I chaired part of the Select Committee, especially in the latter parts of the homosexual law reform legislation. I was part of a group that made a decision in the end to shut down the Select Committee. It had been going for a very long time, and we decided that we'd had every argument put to us probably about 10 times it could possibly exist, and it was important to move along and give the Parliament a chance to debate the issue. But there were real opportunities for people around the country to tell their stories and to give their views, and there was a massive variety. In a way, the committee was generally better. The witnesses to the committee, some of them were pretty awful, but when you're not too far away from people and looking them in the eye, it is somewhat easier than people right across the house or at a rally outside. And the other thing to remember is that there was, while there was some imbalance across party lines, actually within parties there were strong views on both sides of the issue. And it did, some of us sort of learnt some of the lessons of the damage that can be done within parties, because members of the same caucus were on occasions pretty viciously attacking each other, and those relationships cause scars, which I think, as far as I'm concerned, with a couple of members never healed. The stuff that they said to me about people who were my friends were, beyond forgivable.
I chaired the Marriage Equality Select Committee as well, and at the start of it, I said that, I didn't want to go through the sort of exercise that I knew the Homosexual Law Reform Bill had been through, where they just had repetitive submissions over and over and over and over. It doesn't add to the consideration of the committee at all, which is the point of a select committee. And I also didn't think that we should, just drag it out. But I wanted people with different views to be heard, and heard respectfully. So I said at the start of the start of select committee that as the chair, the only thing I wouldn't tolerate was intolerance, whether it was from a submitter or whether it was from a member of the committee. And I only had to twice use that card out of so many hours of submissions, where there was one submitter I remember, because he was a former member of Parliament, and he described marriage equality in just such a terrible way. He basically said it was making marriage like a second-class citizen, like honorary whites were in South Africa. Māori were honorary whites. And I said to him, stop. Can you say your point in a less offensive way? You've just offended a lot of people, and I won't have that, so can you say it in a less offensive way? And he said no, and I said, goodbye, finished. And I think that got the message to the other submitters that you could say something really strongly, but you couldn't do it in a way that was hurtful or offensive to people, that they're entitled to their views as well. So we got through that, as I say, with only 2 occasions that I had to use that. But what it also exposed to me, and I guess I didn't really think about it as much during the Homosexual Law Reform Bill, but I realised how much of what I would automatically think was bigotry was actually genuine ignorance. Some people don't know gay people. They've never met a person who they know to be gay.
Yeah, they don't know they know gay people. They do know gay people, but they don't know that they know gay people.
That's absolutely right. They've never met somebody who they know to be gay. So they have this genuinely ignorant idea of their lifestyle, and it's not like theirs, and they're scared of it. They think it's wrong. And that, there's a bit of space to do work there. I talked to the whips of both parties at the time of the Marriage Equality Bill and explained that. I said, I remember talking to the National Party whip and saying, here's what one of your members did today at the Select Committee. I don't think he's a bigot. I don't think he's a person inspired by any hatred. I think he's genuinely ignorant. Can you get some gay members of your party to meet him, talk to him, get him to know that their life is just like everyone else's? And the whip took on that challenge. I hope they did, because that's the only way in the end that will progress to the next step of a more inclusive society. It is through education and understanding and a developing of genuine respect, regardless of your differences.
And there were some, there were lighter moments. There were some, sort of really good times, talking with especially gay men around the country about the difference it could make and the hope that was being created by the legislation. And even within the debate, there were times. There's a long departed, long dead member, Trevor DeClean, who was from Palmerston North. He was on occasions a shocker of a debater, but there was one line that he used he was supportive of the legislation. One line he used, he said, "From everything that everyone on the other side's saying, you sound like you're going to make it compulsory." Well, that's nonsense. And it was just stuff like that managed to lighten the Parliament and sometimes to relieve the pressure, the intensity, which was pretty heavy in there. It wasn't helped by the fact that the chairman of the committees, John Terrace, a former Anglican minister, was himself, in my opinion, a bigot, and it meant that a lot of the Trevor Young was an assistant speaker, the father of a gay man, but himself very heavily against the legislation, and it meant that through the committee stages it took a lot longer than it should have, because the presiding officers, all of the presiding officers, were adamantly opposed to the legislation. One of the things that I think is wonderful is that that Gaylor reform is not only part of our law, but it's celebrated. And the fact that we have out gay MPs is something which is acknowledged and welcomed, and it's part of us being a House of Representatives. You know, we are saying by having this room that there's a group in our community who are welcomed and are valued, and I think that's great.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I especially like the progress that we've made, being represented on the walls with the different signing off by the Governor General of passing of the acts. I think it's a really look where we've been, and that's a really important way of where are we going in the future. You can't really map a clear path ahead if you haven't looked in the rear vision mirror.